Okay, so thank you. So I wanted to introduce Marc Levine, who is here visiting with the Advanced Criminal Procedure class, and I think we'll also be able to post this short interview up on our web, and Mr. Levine will be able to post it also on his website or wherever. So Marc Levine is the Chief of Policy and Innovation for the Right on Crime Initiative at the Texas Public Policy Foundation. He's an attorney and author on legal and public policy issues, and he began the Texas Public Policy Foundation's criminal justice program in 2005. He's contributed nationally to policy changes that have been followed by dramatic declines in crime and incarceration here in Texas. In 2010, Mr. Levine developed the concept for the Right on Crime Initiative, which was done in partnership with the Prison Fellowship and the American Conservative Union Foundation. It's been a national clearinghouse for conservative criminal justice reforms and has contributed to the adoption of policies in dozens of states that fight crime, support victims, and protect taxpayers. So Mr. Levine is a prolific writer. He's written a number of policy papers and articles. He's been published in a variety of publications. I'm going to just read a partial list here, including the Wall Street Journal, USA Today, the Texas Review of Law and Politics, the New York Daily News, the Toronto Star, the Atlantic Journal-Constitution, the San Francisco Chronicle, the Dallas Morning News, the Houston Chronicle, so a variety of publications around the country. He graduated with honors from the University of Texas with a BA in Plan 2, honors in government, and then got his JD also with honors from the University of Texas. So I appreciate a double University of Texas graduate speaking to us here at Texas A&M. So maybe if I could just start it out by asking you if you could just describe what you see as the priorities right now for the Right on Crime Initiative, and maybe just more generally a conservative perspective on criminal legal reform.
Sure. Well, you know, I think that really sometimes people express surprise that there would be interest in this issue from the right, but really a lot of what motivates, you know, us is kind of a skepticism of government and a real interest in, of course, protecting individual liberty. But of course, we also realize that public safety has to be prioritized. And so I think that what we've really seen since we started is that a lot of policymakers across the spectrum realized that we had been spending all this money on building more prisons, but we weren't getting a commensurate public safety return for that money. And many people were coming out from prison in worse shape than when they arrived. And so Newt Gingrich actually was one of our first signatories to Right on Crime, said if 2/3 of the bridges we built collapsed, it would be a national scandal. He was referring to the fact that 2/3 of people who went to prison would recidivate or go back to prison within several years of being released. So that actually really kind of is what led to the First Step Act. Because we began working with the White House and frankly, both the administration and members of Congress saw that Texas, many states had been successful in both reducing crime and reducing their incarceration rate. And so there developed this interest across the spectrum in how can we do this at the federal level. And what really brought people together to begin with was the idea of reducing recidivism and strengthening reentry, because everybody can kind of unite around, regardless of how, what do you think about sentencing laws, which fortunately sentencing reform did become part of the First Step Act in the Senate, but it began really in the House as a earned time focused bill on saying people in federal prison should be able to earn time for completing recidivism reduction programs. So
maybe if I could just interrupt you for 1 minute, just to make sure, because some of the folks watching this, some of our students may not be as familiar with the First Step Act. So if you could just give a brief description of what it is and what it's done.
Yeah, well, and of course, it's come up in the last few days here as it relates to the campaign. And it's something that both Senator Cory Booker, who spoke at the Democratic Convention, and President Donald Trump and many others played a large role in. And so really what happened is we actually started meeting with the White House when Jeff Sessions was still Attorney General. And one area where we found common ground, despite some significant differences with Attorney General Sessions, was this idea that, yes, people that come out of prison, we need to do something so that they go through programs, that they have a change in perspective versus when they came in, and that also we equip them with skills and provide opportunities when they leave prison, because it's incredibly difficult. You have a scarlet letter of a criminal record. Oftentimes, even before the pandemic, finding a place to live is very difficult. So the discussions with the White House and congressional leaders essentially led to the House bill, which passed the House. It originally just, and at that point, it was just a back-end bill focused on federal prisons and allowing people to earn time off their sentences by completing various programs. And then once it went over to the Senate, thanks largely to Senator Mike Lee and Senator Dick Durbin, there was an addition of some sentencing reform to roll back some of the really punitive federal drug sentencing, even life in prison for a third drug offense at the federal level. It took that away. It's still 20 years, but it's a long time. But it also provided an expanded safety valve, so federal judges could depart in low-level drug cases from the mandatory minimums. And those had been, these types of reforms also were basically things that many states had enacted, whether it was Oklahoma or Georgia. They had rolled back drug mandatory minimums. We had actually gotten, along with others, these policies like, reining in drug mandatory minimums passed as model policies by the American Legislative Exchange Council, which is the organization of conservative state lawmakers. So this didn't come out of nowhere. And you actually had members of Congress like Doug Collins from Georgia, Tom Tillis from North Carolina, who had been behind many of these similar reforms when they were state legislators. So that really also helped us to have them in Congress say, our states did this and the sky didn't fall. Actually, crime kept going down. So that's been kind of the story of it.
Okay, good. And you've mentioned some of the initiatives that I think have also been more broadly initiatives with the Right on Crime, beyond the parole and re-entry. You've kind of, I think maybe a little bit touched on overcriminalization, which I know is one of the focus areas for Right on Crime. Maybe if you could talk a little bit about that, and maybe in connection with that, what you did talk about is the sentencing laws and what your perspective is on how sentencing laws have been and have been changing.
Yeah, no, overcriminalization is a really important issue, and I think it's one that brings a lot of people on the right to the whole area of criminal justice reform. And, so at the federal level, the General Accounting Office did a study a number of years ago, and they got to 4,500 federal criminal laws, and then they gave up. And there's actually many more federal regulations, hundreds of thousands, that carry criminal penalties, and there's no one place you can go to see all of them. So it really, as a law professor, I'm sure one of the phrases you've heard many times is ignorance of the law is no excuse. Well, that's all well and good if you can tell what the law is, but when there's so many criminal laws that you can't figure out what's against the law, and of course, sometimes many of the laws are vague as well. And, it's a problem in Texas also. I've often pointed out there's 11 felonies in Texas relating to harvesting oysters, thousands of state crimes on the books, and most of them outside of the penal code, where you have your traditional crimes, which everyone agrees should be against the law. Everybody knows rape and theft and such are against the law, but then you have all these obscure Texas crimes like injuring a pollinating insect, and the average person doesn't know that could land them behind bars. And again, it's very few cases, obviously, but just having these laws out there is a threat to liberty. And one of the things in Texas we've also focused on is these laws, and it's true at the federal level, they give the agency discretion to create crimes by rule. So in Texas, for example, there's a statute that says it's a Class A misdemeanor to violate any rule of an occupational licensing agency. So if that board of that agency meets every month, every time they create a rule, there's automatically this criminal penalty attaching to it. So we would like to kind of rein in this delegation that's rather unlimited in many instances. So, and then in the real world, you see examples of this, like with the Eric Gardner case in New York, where, he was selling loose cigarettes and was suffocated, and ended up dying after a confrontation with the police. And, even someone like Sean Hannity said, this shouldn't have been a crime to begin with, or it certainly shouldn't have wound up being somewhere a case where somebody would be arrested. Because every time you create a crime, you're putting a burden on law enforcement. You're creating the possibility of a negative interaction. And so I think that one of the things that we really have an opportunity now is to kind of bridge this skepticism of government and too many laws on the right with those on the left who I think are very concerned about the fact that many of these laws, also civil asset forfeiture, which is another issue we've been addressing, they do tend to affect certain communities in a more negative way, that they're more likely to, there's studies that show people that are poor or in minority communities are more likely to be subject to civil asset forfeiture. They're more likely to have their car impounded for not being able to pay a traffic ticket. So they often do bear the brunt of some of this, what I would say is just an example of too much government.
Can I just back you up for a minute to explain what civil asset forfeiture is for the students who, that's maybe a new concept?
Yes, well, it's really kind of a fiction, but what this is if you're just driving, let's say, and pulled over for speeding, the cops can take everything in your car, any money, even your car can be impounded and taken. And basically the law is any property that's connected with a crime basically can be confiscated. Now, there's a difference between seizure and forfeiture. So the real problem is that the title passes to the government even before you're ever convicted. And actually, in Texas, for example, and most states, even if you're never convicted, you don't automatically get your stuff back. You actually have to file a civil lawsuit to do that. And in Texas, the standard of proof is if the government can prove by a preponderance of the evidence, which is only more than a coin flip, 51%, the government gets to keep your stuff. And you have cases where it's a 1995 Chevy and it would cost more for a person to hire a lawyer to file the civil suit to get it back than the property would be worth. So the government ends up winning by default. It's grossly unfair. And half of the proceeds go to police and half to prosecutors. So they have a vested interest. Now, I don't think most police or most prosecutors are motivated by that necessarily. And you know, obviously we're in a really difficult moment, you know, regarding policing. And I think most police try to do their level best job. And obviously there's examples where they fall short, or some fall short of that. But nonetheless, we ought to be funding police and prosecution out of general revenues, not an eat what you kill model, which this is really an example of.
This is actually a nice segue into what's going on right now, which is the calls for defunding the police, which I think is a little bit of an inappropriate term, because they're really, I think there's very few that are calling for complete defunding. It's really about decreasing funding and putting funding in other places, like towards social services, mental health care, that kind of thing. So I'm curious what your view, if there is, you know, I think there's probably a variety of views amongst conservatives about these discussions, but if there's, you know, I don't know that Right on Crime has yet kind of taken a position on this issue, but if you can just explain kind of as you see it with these discussions and where, from your perspective, you'd like to see these discussions going.
Yes, well, I really do think it's a misplaced slogan. I don't know who came up with it, but obviously I feel what we really need is a different kind of policing in some instances. And sometimes, obviously, because of the need to improve police training, which we're really at the forefront of, that actually can cost more money just to provide the necessary training. And, you know, part of it is in, you know, communications and de-escalation skills. The Sandra Bland case was a perfect example here in Texas in 2015. I encourage everyone to watch the video of that, which you can do on YouTube. And the officer escalated the situation, and obviously it tragically ended in her death. And you know, the officer was rude and provocative, and you know, there's no reason for that. And so that's part of what proper training can address. And you know, the other thing is certainly, one of the things we've promoted is focused deterrence, violence interrupters, where police can work hand in hand with credible messengers, which can include people that were formerly incarcerated and gang members who can come back to those communities and kind of help people not make the same mistakes they did. And some of them are now working as ministers. There's just amazing stories. And in Oakland, this has resulted in shootings being cut in half from 2012 to 2018. So those types of things actually require resources to implement. And we do worry that if the money is just there to respond to calls, and therefore all of the contacts between police and community members are in some type of, potentially negative circumstance, instead of starting out with real community engagement, that does take time to build those relationships. So another thing we're really excited about is co-responding, which, both President Trump and certainly a number of leaders on the other side have embraced as well, where, a police officer and a mental health counselor both respond. And, I just think about the situation where someone's about to jump off a bridge, for example, and, the counselor can hopefully talk them out of it, but if that is not working out, the officer can provide a restraint and make sure it doesn't happen. And, there can also be those situations where maybe you don't need an officer. In Connecticut, they have 14 mobile mental health crisis units, and you could just have a situation where somebody's, yelling in a fast food restaurant or something, and maybe the initial person showing up, and you can have backup on call of an officer. So we need more research about, which situations require which types of responses. And, of course, the other interesting thing, sometimes when people think of defunding, they think of fewer police. And I think it's kind of a false analogy to draw a comparison with incarceration, because in incarceration, it's very clear we have 5% of the world's population and 20% of the world's prisoners. So we're way off the charts if you compare us to Europe. And there's real differences between our societies. I'm not saying we should be exactly at the level of Germany or any other country like that. I think that that's not the case. But but the other part of it is there's clear research showing that once you reach a certain point in incarceration, you reach diminishing or even negative returns as you put low-risk individuals, people arrested for drug possession and things in prison who would not be committing serious crimes were they not in prison. So now if you contrast that with police, we actually have fewer police per capita than France, than Mexico, than Spain, than Turkey. So if you just do an international comparison, we're not out of line in terms of how many police we have. And so I think that, clearly their staffing patterns need to be discussed and analyzed in each community, response times. There's a lot of factors, but we don't kind of like the idea of ideologically saying at the beginning, we need fewer police, or that, police need less equipment. Now, we have addressed the issue of militarization of police, where certainly you don't want to see even school districts in Texas, some of them have military equipment secondhand from the U.S. military, which is really alarming. And you do have situations where SWAT teams have been used, like the Breonna Taylor case, and something where it's, even though they got it wrong, right? Even if they were right, it was a minor case. It didn't warrant what was done, even if they had the right house. So we want to have clear guidelines about when you're going to use those types of tactics. So it's there's a lot of important issues to discuss. I just think defunding the police is kind of the wrong frame for examining them.
And I'm going to ask you one more question, and then we'll call it an end and adjourn this part of it, which is COVID-19. Obviously, there's a lot of concerns about what's going on with COVID-19 rates in our jails and prisons, and fairly recent numbers coming out about how many so far have died who've been incarcerated, and then also prison guards who've gotten ill and have died. So obviously it doesn't just stay with those who are incarcerated, and concerns about infection rates going from points of incarceration into the general public when people are released. So I'm curious, in this era, at this moment, what do you think should be going on? Should we be looking at changing things because of COVID-19, or is just COVID-19 yet another reason why we should be doing the changes we should have been doing anyway?
Yeah, no, that's exactly right. And we've been focused even before COVID-19 on the need, for example, to address medical and geriatric release. In Texas in 2019, before COVID, 500 people in prison died and only 60 were approved for medical release. And there were many hundreds, more than 1,000 recommended by doctors, but very few, obviously, kind of given the green light by the parole board. And then so many ended up dying. And obviously, many prisoners have died this year, as you also recognize, correctional staff from COVID. And so we would like to expand the eligibility for medical parole next session here in Texas. One of the limitations is now for one side of it, you have to be within 6 months of dying, which is very difficult to determine. And the main focus really ought to be is this person a danger to public safety? And we now have 300 paraplegics in Texas prisons. It's going to be 500 within a few years. I mean, and then there's people on dialysis, there's people in a coma, there's lots of folks who just can't present a threat to the public. And so, and then of course you have the data, which I'm sure you're very familiar with, that age is really one of the top factors in terms of correlating with recidivism. So people that are 55, 60, 65, they have recidivism rates of 2 or 3%. So beyond that, obviously, I know a number of correctional systems have looked at people that are within a very short time of release, and some states have done more than others. Iowa's a good example. Governor Reynolds has worked with the parole board there. They've released about 10% of people. They did this in the first month or two after COVID. And they did, an individualized analysis. It wasn't a, let's just wholesale randomly release a bunch of people. I don't think anybody could support that. But you obviously, fortunately, we have some really good risk assessments that are pretty accurately, there's no crystal ball or perfection, but identify people that are very unlikely to recidivate. And then the other part of that is trying to put in place protective factors for people, which include, employment if they need to continue with a mental health treatment, a prescription that they're on, make sure that's in place, mentoring, a valid home plan, which can include a subsidized halfway house or housing vouchers, which is probably better given COVID. Some of the halfway houses have had problems. So, and then another piece of this whole thing is technology. I actually just spoke a few days ago with the head of TDCJ, Brian Collier, who's a good friend, and I'm really glad they've recently ordered tablets, and that'll enable them to deliver programming as well as video visitation. In Texas, we actually have about almost 15,000 people that have been approved for parole but are waiting on completing programs before they can be released. So they've been able to get more of the units off of lockdown, which means getting people into those in-person programs more than was the case 2 months ago. But there's still a lot of people that can't get in. So these tablets are going to help facilitate completing these programs, whether it's substance abuse, cognitive behavioral therapy, that are really important. So testing obviously has been another, and some prisons people are making masks. There's also hand sanitizer being made. So there have been some innovations. And then one of the things we're really excited about is the innovations we're seeing in community supervision, particularly using video virtual check-ins, whether it's Zoom or another technology, so people don't have to go to a probation office, or if they're on pretrial, they don't have to go to a routine hearing in a court, which is probably closed anyway. And the really interesting thing is there's some data out of Michigan and New Jersey, for example, that the rates of failure to appear have gone from 15 or 20% to 1 or 2%, which is kind of an indication of the fact that people that were missing their pretrial or probation appointments before, they weren't absconding. It was that they couldn't get childcare, they couldn't get away from their job, and they were sick, things like that. And so one of the biggest sources of technical revocations, people being revoked either to jail if they're in the pretrial, or prison if they're on probation, or parole, is missing meetings. So being able to hopefully preserve some of these virtual check-ins and hearings as we hopefully return to a normal justice system and reopen our courts, I think we can still use some of these techniques and actually have a better system.
And it's been already a little bit of a point of conversation, and it's going to be a much bigger one. What of these technologies are going to be more permanent and are going to be a regular feature, right? So I'm going to end this here now. So thank you very much.